My name is Eleanor. I'm 72 years old, and about a year ago, I realized something that took me a long time to admit to myself. My kids had stopped visiting. Not completely, not dramatically. There wasn't a big fight or some terrible falling out. They just stopped coming the way they used to. At first, I didn't notice. Life after 70 moves quietly. Days blend together if you're not careful. A week goes by, then another. Then suddenly it's been a month since anyone sat at your kitchen table. I told myself all the things parents tell themselves. They're busy. They have children of their own. They're tired. All of that was true, but truth doesn't make the house feel less empty. I have 2 children, a son who lives about 40 minutes away, and a daughter who moved to another city about 3 years ago. They're good people. I raised them well, kind, responsible, hardworking, which is exactly why their lives are so full now. When they were young, this house felt like a train station. Friends in and out, homework on the counter, someone always opening the refrigerator. Back then, I used to dream about quiet. I thought quiet would feel peaceful. What I didn't realize was that quiet, if it lasts too long, starts to echo. And echoes remind you of who isn't there. The moment that made me truly see the distance happened last winter. It was a Sunday afternoon, cold outside. The kind of day when families usually gather somewhere warm. I had made soup, not because anyone was coming, just out of habit. When you cook for 40 years, your hands keep doing it even when no one's around to eat it. I set the bowl down at the table and looked at the empty chairs. 4 chairs. For decades, those chairs were never empty. Now they were. That's when the thought crossed my mind for the first time. When did they stop coming? I started thinking back. Visits had gradually become shorter, then less frequent, then mostly holidays, then mostly phone calls, and even those calls were quick. Hi, Mom, just checking in. Sorry, it's been busy. Let's catch up soon. Soon is a very slippery word. Soon can mean next week, or it can mean never. I tried not to take it personally, but loneliness has a way of making everything feel personal. For a while, I fell into a habit I'm not proud of, complaining. When my daughter called, I talked about how quiet the house felt. When my son stopped by for 20 minutes on his way somewhere else, I mentioned how long it had been since I'd seen him. I thought I was being honest. What I didn't realize was that my honesty sounded like guilt. And guilt doesn't invite people back. It pushes them away. I began noticing something else too. Whenever they did visit, I spent most of the time talking about the past. Remember when you were little? Remember the old house? Remember your father's terrible jokes? Memories are beautiful. But if every conversation is about yesterday, people start feeling like there's nothing left to say about today. One afternoon, my son stopped by unexpectedly. He stayed maybe 15 minutes. He hugged me goodbye at the door and said something that stayed with me for days. "Mom, you should get out more." He said it kindly, but I heard something else inside that sentence. Your life has become too small. And he was right. After my husband passed away 5 years ago, I slowly shrank my world. Not intentionally. Grief does that quietly. I stopped driving far, stopped meeting friends as often, stopped trying new things. My routines became comfortable, too comfortable. Morning coffee by the window, a walk around the block, dinner in front of the television, day after day. I had been waiting for my children to fill the space my husband left behind. But they had lives of their own to carry. That realization hurt. Then it did something unexpected. It woke me up. I asked myself a question that felt uncomfortable. What if the problem isn't that they stopped visiting? What if the problem is that I stopped moving? That thought stayed with me for weeks. Then one morning, while washing dishes, I made a small decision. I would stop waiting. Waiting had turned my life into a hallway. And hallways are not places people stay long. So I decided to change something. Not them, me. The first thing I did was simple. Instead of asking my daughter when she could come visit, I asked if I could visit her. She was quiet on the phone for a moment. "Of course you can, Mom," she said. But I could hear the surprise in her voice, because I hadn't done that in years. That visit changed more than I expected. And it wasn't the only change I made. There were a few small things I decided to do differently. And slowly, almost without noticing, my life began to widen again. The first time I drove to my daughter's house, instead of waiting for her to come to mine, I felt strangely nervous. It had been years since I made that drive on purpose. Not because I couldn't, because I had convinced myself it was easier if everyone came to me. That's how it had always been when the kids were younger. Birthdays here, holidays here, Sunday dinners here. This house had been the center. But life changes centers. And sometimes parents don't notice when the map shifts. My daughter lives in a small, busy neighborhood about an hour away. Houses close together. Kids riding bikes in the street. When I pulled into her driveway, there were toys scattered across the yard. I could hear one of my grandchildren shouting from inside before I even knocked. The door opened and my daughter looked genuinely surprised. Not unhappy, just surprised. "Mom, I didn't think you meant today." I smiled and said, "I figured I'd stop waiting for a special occasion." She laughed and hugged me, and something softened immediately. The house was chaos. Dishes in the sink, laundry folded halfway on the couch, one of the dogs barking at nothing in particular. 5 years ago, I might have walked into that house and immediately started commenting, "You should really clean up before guests come. You're too busy. You should slow down." But that day I said none of those things. Instead, I stepped inside and joined the chaos. My youngest granddaughter dragged me to the living room to show me a drawing she had made. My grandson asked if I wanted to see his new soccer shoes. Dinner that night was loud and imperfect. Someone spilled milk. Someone else refused to eat vegetables. But I noticed something important. I wasn't a guest. I was part of the noise again. After dinner, while my daughter washed dishes, I asked if she wanted help. She looked relieved. That relief told me something. For years, she had been carrying her life at full speed, and visiting me had become one more thing to manage. But when I stepped into her world, instead of asking her to step out of it, the pressure changed. Over the next few months, I began doing that more often. Sometimes I drove to her house just to sit at the kitchen table while she worked. Sometimes I went to my grandson's soccer games. I started bringing small things: soup when she was busy, cookies for the kids, sometimes just my time. And I noticed something else change: the way we talked. Before, our phone calls had a pattern. I would talk about how lonely the house felt. She would apologize. We would both hang up feeling a little guilty. Now our conversations were about real life again. School projects, funny things the kids said, what she was struggling with at work. When people feel useful in each other's lives, conversation becomes easier. That lesson took me 72 years to understand. I made a similar change with my son. He works long hours and rarely has time for long visits. So instead of waiting for him to come to me, I started meeting him where his life already existed. There's a small diner near his office. One morning I called him and said, "Are you free for breakfast this week?" He hesitated. "I've got work early, Mom." "That's perfect," I said. "I'll meet you there." We met at 7 in the morning, 30 minutes before his workday started. Coffee, eggs, a quick conversation, nothing dramatic. But something important happened during that breakfast. We stopped being formal with each other. When visits happen rarely, people feel pressure to make them meaningful. Every conversation feels like it should be important. But when you see someone regularly in small ways, the pressure disappears. You talk about ordinary things. Ordinary things build real connection. We started meeting at that diner once a month, then sometimes twice. Those small breakfasts became something I looked forward to. And I think he did too. Another change I made was more personal. I stopped talking about my loneliness as if it were their responsibility. That was hard. Loneliness is real, but when you place the weight of it on someone else's shoulders, they start avoiding the conversation entirely. Instead of saying, "I'm lonely," I started saying things like, "I joined a walking group last week. I tried a new recipe. I went to the library talk on Thursday." Something interesting happened when I did that. My children stopped worrying about me in a heavy way. And because they didn't feel guilty anymore, they began calling more often. Guilt pushes people away. Interest pulls them closer. I also made an effort to make my life larger than my children. For a long time, my identity had been mother and wife. When my husband passed away, half that identity disappeared. And without realizing it, I expected my children to fill that empty space. But children are not meant to carry their parents' emotional lives. They can share in them, but they cannot become them. So I began rebuilding parts of my life I had quietly abandoned. I joined a book club at the library. I started gardening again. I volunteered twice a month at a small community kitchen. None of these things were dramatic, but they did something powerful. They reminded me that my life still had movement. Movement attracts connection. Waiting creates distance. About 6 months after I began making these changes, something happened that made me smile. It was a Saturday morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone rang. It was my daughter. "Mom, are you busy today?" "Not particularly," I said. "We're coming over." That sentence felt like sunlight in winter. A few hours later, the house was full again. Kids running through the hallway, shoes piled by the door, noise bouncing off the walls. And I realized something important. My kids hadn't stopped loving me. They had simply continued living their lives. And I had been standing still, waiting for them to circle back. When I stepped forward into their world, instead of holding on to the old one, the distance between us became much smaller. At 72, I learned something I wish someone had told me earlier. Connection doesn't stay alive on memories alone. It needs movement. Sometimes the parent has to move first, not because love is unequal, but because love, like life, changes shape. And when you adapt to that shape instead of resisting it, something beautiful happens. Your family finds you again, not because they have to, because they want to. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.